Um, here's my idea for timekeeping is this high-tech Post-it note. Can you see this? I can't actually see myself right now. So I don't know if, yeah. So I'll hold this up when you have 1 minute left. And then when you're out of time, I will hold this up. Great. So Kathy.
I did figure out how to record. So we are now recording.
Okay. Awesome.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Okay, Kathy, take it away.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. This is just an awesome opportunity to have this conversation. So thank you. So I'm just going to briefly explain the things that I found in my research for that book, The Politics of Resentment, and the themes that Erica mentioned. So I think it's important for me to explain that when I started my research, I was not looking for a rural versus urban divide. I grew up in Wisconsin, have spent most of my life here, but naively did not know that such a divide exists. But what I was doing was I studied public opinion, and I won't go into the details of why I was doing this, but I was inviting myself into the conversations of people, basically regulars who meet in places like gas stations and diners and sometimes churches in a variety of communities, several dozen communities throughout the state of Wisconsin, including urban and suburban communities. But about a year in, it was just apparent to me that what I was hearing in the smaller places, in the rural places in Wisconsin, was surprising to me, intense, and politically probably really important. Because what I was hearing was people saying in a variety of different ways, we don't get what we deserve. We deserve more. We're not getting our fair share. And just some brief context here, you may know or may not know, but in Wisconsin, there's two main metropolitan areas. There's Madison and Milwaukee, and Madison's the state capital, and Milwaukee is the kind of the industrial center. But it's a relatively rural state. Roughly half the population, depending on how you classify people, lives in a non-metropolitan area. So it's roughly 50-50 rural, urban, and I'm doing the hand quotes here because, you know, there's so many different ways we can define rural, but the people outside of the metropolitan areas were saying things like, you know, all the decisions are made in Madison and Milwaukee and communicated out to us, that there's little listening going on in reverse. We don't have much political power. We really don't have much say in the decisions that affect our lives. And they were talking about politics, but about industries and, you know, variety of aspects of life. They just felt like their voices didn't matter. And they were also saying that their perception was that all the wealth was in the cities, all the resources go to the cities. So they perceive, you know, the cities, if there's wealth in the state, it's in the cities, it's in the Madison and metro areas. That's where all the good jobs are. And it seemed to them that they were paying a lot of taxes and they couldn't see it, right? They didn't see it coming back to their communities. And it seemed to them that it was all going to the city. So when they went down to Madison for the state wrestling, high school wrestling tournament or the state basketball tournaments, there's all these cranes, all this construction. It seemed like things were really happening in Madison, but certainly not in their own towns. And they were also telling me that they weren't getting their fair share of respect because it seemed to them that the people making the decisions didn't understand what life was like in rural Wisconsin, certainly spent time in rural Wisconsin, but as tourists, right? Passing through to go fishing, to camp, to stay in a resort, but didn't understand that a lot of people in these beautiful towns are busting their rear ends when the weather finally gets good enough for them to enjoy it, right? So they that the people making the decisions didn't understand the challenges that they face, and honestly looked down on them. So they felt, disrespected by the people in the cities. There was an awareness that in general, people in small towns and rural places are seen as less educated and less sophisticated and sexist and racist and homophobic. And so in all these different ways, in terms of the attention and the resources and the respect, they felt like they were on the short end of the stick. And a lot of the time, I'm driving around as a social scientist from the flagship university in my Volkswagen Jetta, having coffee with people early in the morning. And so they're relaying all this to me, fully aware that like I'm one of them in the way that they're saying, and they're joking with me. You can imagine, right? Super kind. So often not angry, but just resentful, right? It came up in a variety of aspects of our conversation, but it was clear that they had this mental map of the state in which there was Madison and Milwaukee, and then the rest of the state, and resentful about it. And I started this fieldwork in 2007. And then in 2010, Scott Walker, a Republican, became governor. And so this sentiment was there well before Scott Walker came onto the scene. And as far as I can tell, has been growing probably since the 70s. It's hard to say exactly, but I know as I'm describing this general sentiment is familiar to a lot of you. So it certainly wasn't new when I started doing this field work. I think it had been growing for some time. One other thing I want to point out before I move on too much is that when they were talking about feeling like they weren't getting their fair share and that they deserved more, they were often talking about their perceptions of who works hard in the population. And I think this is really important because a lot of times they would ask me questions about my job, ask, how is it possible that you are driving around the state having coffee with people? Like, how is that a job, right? How is that hard work? And sort of contrasting the people who sit behind desks and do like knowledge economy, so-called knowledge economy kind of work, compared to people who were using their bodies, doing manual labor, not just farming, right? But the many other jobs that are relatively common in our rural spaces. And, sometimes they would joke with me about like, when do you take a shower, Kathy? And I'd say, well, before I go to work. And they'd say, yeah, well, I work so hard. They would say, like, I have to take a shower when I get home. It's the first thing I have to do when I get home. And just kind of pointing out to me like how hard they work compared to the kind of work that I do. And I just think when we think about the nature of the economies in our rural spaces, that kind of sentiment of the perspective of who's working hard is really important because it was so interwoven with their sense of who's deserving, right? That they felt like they were working really hard and deserved more. Now, the reason that I thought this was so important politically is that there's so many different layers to it. I haven't mentioned race at all yet, but it's a big part of what's going on because this sentiment of resentment toward the cities has all these different layers to it, right? It's resentment toward the city people, but urban elites, the Democratic Party, and people of color. And I think it was important for me to listen to the way resentment toward people like me, professionals in the city or urban elites or white professionals or relatively wealthy white people was interwoven with resentment toward people of color as well. Because when Scott Walker came along and tapped into this sentiment by pointing the finger of blame at public employees, he was also activating racism. And so what Scott Walker did was to say, you're right to be so upset. You do deserve more. You are working hard. And you're right that there are people who are getting way more than they deserve, and vote for me and I'll change all that. And he was basically saying it's the public employees who are the haves. And then there are the have-nots who are, by implication, people in the private sector, which is twisted in some ways, but in a lot of ways, it resonated with people because in many of these communities, it is the public employees who had pensions, who had healthcare, and who were making relatively more money than other people in these smaller communities, right? Donald Trump was a different politician, clearly, but in his own way was saying, you're right to be so upset. You do deserve more, and you are real hardworking Americans. And I say that by raising my eyebrows in terms of like trying to, thank you, Erica, say to people like there are the real Americans, or there are the real Wisconsinites, and then there are these other people who are getting way more than their fair share. And I think just since 2016, this divide, I don't have great evidence to show to you, but my sense is that it's just strengthened because it's become so much more front and center in terms of like, yes, there's this thing, this rural versus urban, front and center for people in rural spaces, but as also in urban spaces. I think we see more resentment among urbanites toward rural people, and just the way in which the economy in rural spaces has not recovered from the Great Recession the way it has in our more urban areas means there's just more resentment than ever, I think. So thank you, I'll stop there.
Perfect timing. And I hate having to stop you, and I'm sure I'm going to hate having to stop everyone.
Really,
there's so much more you could say.
Yeah, no, I'm all done.
Oh, perfect. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Okay, next up is Arlie.
And what are we, about 5-10 minutes?
10 minutes, and I'll give you a 1-minute warning.
Great. Well, thanks, Kathy. And so much of what you've said about rural whites feeling overlooked, distended, non-recipients, hardworking, deserving, rings a bell with me, given the research I began in 2011 in southern Louisiana among Tea Party people. I thought I could just try to bring a little bit up to date what's happening with the folks that I researched there. And the first thing they would say to me, I would say, like you would, Kathy, and I guess, Jen, it's how you also began, look, hey, hi, I am who I am from where I am, open book, come to see you. And the first thing I would hear, people would say, well, okay, you're here at the Republican Women of Southwest Louisiana. What are you doing here? And I'd say, well, I'm from Berkeley, California, and so on. And I'm worried about the divide. That would be the first way I could access them. And they say, yeah, well, we're worried about it too. And then they would say, but we're worried about because you people don't understand who we are. We're the flyover state. You think we're backward and uneducated and prejudiced and homophobic and sexist and so on, and fat. They added that. So that's what you think of us. And I would say, well, that's why I'm here. I'd like you to tell me what would be an accurate way of understanding you. So can I visit where you were born, the schools you were in, what row did you sit in school, and can we go to the graveyard? Were any of your ancestors, in a civil war on the Confederate side? But, what I just tried to enter their world and not just report back, but translate back kind of how they thought. That I described as a deep story of that summarized to loss on cultural, economic, demographic, racial grounds. All that felt like a loss to them. And that's kind of chapter 1 of the deep story. Chapter 2 would be carrying it forward. Donald Trump speaks to that loss as savior come, And I was there at a primary rally, and in the bus, I could hear all the people, look how many of us there are. That was kind of how he mobilized that discontent. As we know from Durkheim, it's not the leader, but how he puts the followers together. And then in chapter 3, I would say there's been a creation of a cult of beatification. He says, I suffer for you. First of all, and look at all I do, all the enemies I fight against for you. The treasonous press, the Democratic Party, the deep state. And then he says, so now it's your turn to fight for me. And he calls the white nationalists, and it comes out who his militia is on January 6th. And to bring it up to date, I think now, of course, the Republican Party seems to be splitting, certainly it's in conflict between who they are calling the country club Republicans and the populist Republicans. And my far right people think of themselves as populist Republicans. But some of them, maybe a third, seem to be saying, yes, the election was stolen, but they're divesting their feeling from it. There's a kind of a stages of grief, giving up the fantasy. And then there are the ones who are doubling down. It's a division, people I'm looking at. And they're going crazy. They are in fantasy land, and they're checking into YouTube channels that confirm kind of rumors. So that, I think, brings you up to date to the chapters of development in this sad story. And it's hard to think that 48 and something % of American voters actually voted in a second term, even after they knew who Trump was. I mean, I think it's appalling, and I just think I'm really glad that we're doing what we're doing here. I think there are these three narratives, just to end: globalization, they are the losers of globalization, but I think they are elite of the left behind, the elite of the losers. That's the heart of these folk. And then there's urbanization, they are rural and small town. And then there's race, and they are doubling down, I think, on a racial identity, and also constructing themselves as victims of the left. Oh, it's the left that the racists, they're dividing us up. They're the ones saying, so we're hearing that whole discourse. All of these three narratives add up to loss, which is very different from deprivation. And it's the right leaders, Trump, head of the parade, is manipulating that sense of loss and playing to the emotions that it creates. So I just want to say that I'd love a conversation on all this, and especially on hood to holler, how a kind of social class alliance and racial alliance based on class solidarity could be done to reflect on the obstacles to that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Arlie. And you didn't even use all 10 minutes. You got 2 minutes left. We'll hear more from you in the Q&A, I'm sure. Okay, and welcome again, Jen, and take it away.
Oh, thank you so much for having me today. And I just want to say both Arlie and Kathy have been my intellectual heroes for a very, very long time. So I just want to say, thank you for providing the building blocks for my own study, but also for providing a model of pushing the boundaries of your own field that I just find very inspiring. So We're Still Here, Pain and Politics in the Heart of America explores how poor and working class people, Americans, connect their everyday struggles, everyday hopes and fears to politics. And the book begins with this enduring puzzle, which is that for decades, especially in rural communities, we see blue collar jobs being automated or eliminated. We see politicians on both sides of the aisle gutting the power of the working class. And, this idea that you can give your children a better life, the American dream seems to be fading away. And yet the paradox is that the groups who would seem to gain the most from mobilizing together appear the least motivated to act in their own self-interest. So American non-voters tend to be younger and poorer, more racially diverse. And we also have seen that after the Great Recession of 2008, it actually deepened divisions among people who you would think would join together. So we have white workers, expressing resentment and anger towards racial minorities and immigrants and the poor. And so as a qualitative sociologist, I wanted to kind of go into this and challenge this idea of interests as predetermined or self-evidence, and instead just get to know people, hear about their worldviews, hear how they connected their everyday lives to politics. Or didn't. And so I spent 2 years up through 2017 in the anthracite coal region of Pennsylvania. So this was a area that peaked basically during World War I. The coal mining industry supported 1 million people, and employment in mining is now, there's under 1,000 jobs now in mining. And when you're in these towns, it's every neighborhood used to have a bar and a church on every corner. And now it's just, tattoo parlors, empty storefronts, lots of liquor stores and vape shops. And as this has happened in the area where I was, which is more rural, politicians who advocate for business and against welfare have gained a lot of support. So I ended up conducting 108 interviews and then also spent time with some community leaders. 2 things happened during my study that were, I think, interesting. One is that I wanted it to be about white working class conservatives. I think I secretly wanted to write Arlie's book, but then, of course. But I actually had a really hard time finding people who identified very strongly with any political party at all. And my sample was younger too, their median age was probably 35 to 40. And then also, as I was doing the research with white people, they kept telling me about the newcomers, they called them, who were Black and Latino people who were moving in from the cities. And they would just tell me all about how the newcomers were destroying the town. And so my study actually then shifted to include 40 Black and Latino people who had recently arrived. And so it's kind of, I didn't mean to do this, but it then examines the diversity and divisions within this kind of broad American working class. And as I conducted interviews, the story I heard from people is that they were very critical of growing economic inequality and politicians, but all of the institutions that I expected to mediate this kind of personal suffering were not only weak, but sites of betrayal. And so everyone I talked to, they would take my interview and they'd make it about their individual suffering. And they talk a lot about their family problems and a lot about just the stories of pain that they use to organize their identities, and also to draw these moral boundaries between the deserving and undeserving. And so, yeah, I felt like all of my interview questions, I asked them, but they didn't end up, no one cared, no one thought it was important. They wanted to talk about other kinds of struggles. And so what I found was basically that people were searching for meaning either through self-help or through internet conspiracy theories. And these were both very solitary struggles that would basically turn them inward or turn them against each other. And that they worked very hard to justify disengagement from politics as the safe and empowering and shrewd choice. And I was openly mocked many times for voting or for believing. I had my I voted sticker on one day, and this guy was like, you should take that off. And I'm like, really? He's like, yeah, really. Like, that's embarrassing. And so I would say I heard the themes of resentment, this idea that for the white people had been left behind, but then among the people of color, it was a different kind of story that I heard. So for example, I met a young Black man named Adrian. He was 24, and his mom had moved him to the coal region from, I think, Bed-Stuy, New York. And he said he had actually been, as a teenager, excited to move to the coal region because it seemed like safer and you didn't have to worry about, fights on the street or drugs. But from the moment he arrived, he was kind of systematically harassed by teachers and police, suspended for writing rap lyrics or accused of crime that he didn't commit. And he ends up like dropping out of school and ends up actually selling drugs to survive. In this really interesting way, he told me he had no idea. He thought that crack was a white person drug because he was selling crack in rural Pennsylvania in a way he never had thought to do in New York. And so he was kind of a sad story where he had actually finally found a legitimate job making $11 an hour and then lost it. And he had ended up selling to an undercover and went to jail and has a felony. So I actually talked to him like 2 days after he got out of prison. And it was right before the 2016 presidential election. And he tells me, like, obviously having a Democrat is better, but he says, like, either way, I grew up poor. I'm still poor. Nothing's going to change for me. They're going to make it better for rich people or harder for poor people. And he says, like, there is no American dream. He says it's all about money, people living in their own fantasy world. He's like, if you got money, you do whatever you want. You kill someone, you beat the charges. And then he kind of like goes even further, which is something that happened among many of the young men in my sample, where he like goes into conspiracy theories and talks about this government that's against trying to decimate its own citizens. So he says, what is the government? It's New World Order. I think the government is going to kill people off to control the population. You don't want people, there's so much you don't have as much to worry about. I think they want to have more government issued officers. And I heard like many like varieties of this about kind of fluoride as mind control and like planes going by with mind control drugs and FEMA camps as ways to control the population. And actually like the only time I really heard excitement, like, and when I was trying to talk about politics was about when people were piecing together conspiracy theories or telling me about like self-help, like watching tasty videos and finding chicken recipes. And so to kind of summarize, I would say what united all of the groups in my sample was kind of the embracing of self-help mantras and conspiracy theory. And also like this idea that they should invalidate the suffering of others. And this was also often based like in the family and emotional. So people would tell me stories like, my sister has been abusing the system, she's a drug addict and, she takes welfare and it's wrong, but I've been through so much trauma and I don't need anyone and I only depend on myself. And why would I put my, faith in a politician anyway? Because like pain for me has made me who I am and I'm very, strong and empowered. And so my kind of finding is that individual pain management has almost become this narrative and necessity because, the family and community ties are very fragile. They're very distrustful. There's not very many safety nets and there's not any opportunities either for mobility. And so I guess as we have our conversation, I was to Arlie's point about thinking about alliances. One of the things, it's like, clearly we need to reduce material hardship, but like, is there also like a platform for trying to pull people back into communities and relationships? And the only way I ever saw that done was through kind of collective sharing of pain and things like informal drug support groups and kind of like community forums. And that was like the only place I saw people come together and actually provide advice like across racial groups or gender and, in talking about their own pain, connect with other people. And so I wonder like if we could think about other ways to build like these compassionate bridges that would make a class alliance. I will stop there. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Jen. So we're gonna have about 10 minutes where the three presenters can just kind of talk amongst yourselves. I'm not gonna try and moderate or anything, but you can just all take yourselves off mute and explore each other's work.
Could I just perhaps say thank you both so much. It's really, Kathy, I've already spoken with you, but Jen, it's very exciting for me to hear your report on this. And it really resonates with recent interviews I've been doing. We're in Appalachia, where opiates are huge, ongoing, and continuing crisis. It's not, we like to think, oh, we're on the downhill side, but no. And where the whole recovery, the narrative of recovery, is recovering from a lot. You know, it's not just recovering from addiction, but from despair at loss of a lot of things. And I don't have a systematic sample, but I'm finding a lot of empathy and reach out to Blacks among this despairing white group. They'll say such things. Well, you know, I just knew Alex in school, Alex being a foster child from Detroit, and you know, we and Alex, we hung out, and the other kids, someone tried, this one narrative, one kid tried to harass Alex, but the other kids made him run away. So I'm not getting a racial fear or animosity, but actually an identification and quite a lot of, hey, what's the difference? One guy told me this. What's the difference? You know, he said, I grew up in a trailer park. There was a murder, you know, 3 trailers down. My parents wouldn't let me out of it because my uncle was dealing in the backyard. And so that was their idea of a good childhood, you know, being stuck in the trailer. What I liked about school, he said, I had a learning disability, so they defined me as dumb. And he's the most brilliant person I, by the way, talked to. But he said, and he knew that. And he said, so I'm poor and I'm dumb. And, you know, people go to jail, they deal. What's the difference between my life here and Alex's in Detroit? Alex went back to Detroit, is now in jail. He said, except the music. And then I discovered, so he said, you know, we have this twangy, tragic music here in Appalachia, but, you know, they have rap. Then I discovered there's hillbilly rap. You know, so there is an identification to work with, I think, on the white side. And in a way, but it's very strained, it's very embattled. Like, this is a mad guy who he's mad at the left that he thinks doesn't see him at all and presumes he's racist. So I don't know, I just see little threads of possibility. It's just wondering what you're finding at your end on that.
That's so fascinating, because I was like, you know, kind of actively looking for spaces where you might see kind of solidarity. And I've been criticized a lot, but I really couldn't find very many. And it was only when I was at one of the groups I attended was a like group for family members of addicts. And so the town I was in, one of the doctors ended up going to prison for a very long time because he had prescribed over 1 million opiates in the state of Pennsylvania. And so like there were lots of pharmacy bottles and horrible raging, you only had to, if you were white and you just called them on the phone, you could have kind of anything you wanted for $25. And so, yeah, so it was a really big problem. And the only place so people were they didn't really trust the institutions. And so they were creating their own groups for like helping each other out. So it would just be like people sitting around a table in a house. But it was a place where there would be like newcomers and then older families. And it was like a place where they had actually even share information like, I need to get my son out of the house. He's violent. He's stealing from me. And it would be like, okay, this is like the housing authority. Like, this is how you would apply for like these benefits, even among like white people who were, in their interview, very against all of these benefits. So that's the same thing that happened to me. And they would use like language, like they were like, oh, there's a study that, rats do really well if there's lots of food and water in their, cage. And so, and they're less likely to like drink opioid water if they're in this happy cage. So we need to make our community into like rat heaven and have lots of things to do to not. So it was like this language of working together that was very striking and then completely absent from everywhere else. Like the kind of traditional working class spaces, like the volunteer fire clubs or like Kiwanis or something, were really just kind of racist. So yeah, I didn't see it anywhere else for sure.
Fascinating.
I like that you're finding this though, because I've always felt like I always end my talk talking about this and people are like, that's it? That's all you found? Like what? Then I'm like, that's it. That's all I found.
Oh no, it's a real punchline. Yeah. Yeah.
Fascinating. I'll just add very briefly that in the past year or so during the pandemic, I haven't been doing field work in person, but I've been listening to local talk radio shows in smaller markets basically across the northern US, upper Midwest. So like Twin Falls, Idaho, and Anchorage, Alaska, which obviously isn't Midwest, but Duluth, Minnesota, Green Bay, Wisconsin, and a station out of Fargo, which is actually the show itself was more left leaning. And I was listening to broadcasts about George Floyd's murder to try to understand how these hosts talk about race and racism, and to try to, because I too am very intent on finding possibilities for cross-race collaboration. And what I found very disheartening is even when the callers would say things like, I think there's a pattern, something going on here in the Minneapolis Police Department, at least, like, just kind of edging towards recognition of systematic racism, that the hosts would just, all of them just deflect as much as they could. And it's not like, it's almost innate. I mean, it's not innate, but that they all had this bad apple response, like Derek Chauvin, bad apple, blaming the Democratic Party. Like, Arlie, I think that's so important. And I don't know how recent it is, but the narrative of racism is something the left is using against us, right? As opposed to we are being blamed for being racist, that there's this common theme of the left racism isn't really a thing, but the left is using it to forward or to push forward their socialist agenda. Surprised me.
Yeah.
It's very widespread across these shows.
Yeah, wow. The left, so there are several sorts of things that the white right are feeling. First, blamed initially. Original sin, you're from the South, you're racist, or you're hillbilly racist. And then the left is using it. And then there's a third, that the left is racist, that left itself. Oh, do you know, right. I talked to this guy he's unemployed, he's on disability, and he's living in a trailer. And he is saying, well, I hear that Uber, there is no Uber near him, but he's drenched in kind of what's going on at City, that Uber has a new service that's just for women, or just for Blacks, or just for Black women. Well, now who's racist? Is it us or them? They're separating the people. And then I even heard, I don't know how common this is, but this guy, who I think, I'm not giving up on him as a cross. If we were to get a group together, half Black, half white, he would come forward, I think. He's a lot of possibility with him. He hates Trump, but didn't vote. But it's he who said, I have a nephew whose wishes he were Black, was trying to tan himself. And I have to say to him, look, it's okay to be white. It's okay to be a guy, because the nephew also doesn't think it's, people are saying, oh, all men are chauvinist pigs, so that white men are the new villain. And they feel socked with that, that white men are villains. That's what the left alternative and they associate with Biden are, that's all we have to offer is white men are bad. And where are they getting that from? YouTube and whatever they're watching, but because they don't actually know any more leftists than they do any more Blacks. I take that back. I found actually a lot of progressives, but I think I'm snowballing in that direction too.
Yeah. I also wonder whether, for my research, it almost felt like distrust of authorities could be something that united people across race, where so many of my white and Black respondents were aware that people in power can use race to divide them. And they'd say, the people in power are just bullies. Why are they sending, many of them had been in the military, and say, we know that we're just fighting against the enemy because someone's making money off us. And it was it had such radical potential, but it didn't go really anywhere mostly because people's stories of personal trauma and betrayal made them just not want to get involved with anybody else. And so it's I wonder how to also use that as a way to connect or get people to trust again.
Really interesting. Yeah. To connect on distrust.
Right, I know. Yeah, exactly.
Fascinating. Yeah.
So I'm going to open it up now and invite people who have questions. Just here, let me get everyone in view here. Just wave your hand if you have a question or a comment. Anthony, were you demonstrating or do you have a question?
I was demonstrating and I do have a question. And I was also hoping, I hope that everybody jumps in, but I'm really also particularly curious about Chloe's take on this as somebody who somehow has navigated, I would assume, at least somewhat similar dynamics in your districts in rural Maine to two election victories. I'm really curious whether what Jen and Kathy and Arlie have talked about, was it the same or different? But I have one thing building off of what Jen and Arlie just said. In Appalachia, in Southwestern Virginia, where I am, in Eastern Kentucky, where Arlie's been working, there has a long time been a sense for generations that Richmond, the state capital, or Frankfort, the state capital of Kentucky, have essentially abandoned those communities. And one of the positive outgrowths of that has been there's really a vibrant alternative grassroots kind of economy and culture that has emerged based on a kind of a mutual exasperation with the government. The government's not going to help us. And we don't believe in the big businesses. They never come here. So we've had to kind of make our own way. And it's far from perfect, but it's a little bit of what you were both hinting at, that it's, I don't know that it's overcome the divide, but it has united very liberal, progressive thinking people with very conservative folks around the common sense that they ain't going to help us. We got to do it ourselves. And it sort of generated local action and generated some innovation at the local level. It hasn't added up to changing people's worldviews, but it has added up to this sense of solidarity of being screwed, kind of, by the powers that be. So I think there's a little hint of that in parts of Appalachia from my experience.
Fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, Chloe, I gave you an opening. I'm hoping you might comment, you or Canyon, from your experience.
I was just going to chime in that the distrust bit really resonates with my experience, both in the Carolinas and campaigning in rural Maine. That's a huge part of the story of self and story of us that I tell, and that I think Chloe finds a lot on the doors, and both of us felt growing up a lot distrust for politicians, and for the government, and general frustration with the political system. Chloe, I think Chloe might want to chime in, but she had a great story of she's working on passing a constitutional amendment in Maine, and requires getting a lot of Republicans on board because you need 2/3 vote of the legislature. And she was in a call with over a dozen Republican legislators, and they were kind of like, well, why do we need this amendment? It's a constitutional amendment to guarantee the right to clean air, clean water, and a healthy environment. And Chloe went off on a bit of a rant about how she doesn't trust the government to protect these things for us. And the Republican legislators were just like, damn, it's so refreshing to hear a Democrat say that they don't trust the government. So yeah, I think that's an important theme.
Other questions from anyone? Comments? Takeaways?
But how is this, just a question, with Biden saying, here we are, big government. I just listened to his talk in Lake Charles, Louisiana, with the I-10 bridge behind him. We're going to rebuild this bridge, and work. It was entirely a work narrative, an economic narrative, and this won't be deficit spending. We're going to take from the top 5% of the top 1%. They can keep their second homes and private planes. We're not taking from the rich. We're just the super rich to help you get a new bridge. He was just talking economics, complete sense. He's not an orator, but it just was a great economic sense talk. But it had no culture to it, no appeal to it. Hey, trust the government again to it. So you do have the sinking feeling he's going to run into the very distrust we're hearing. So I don't know, we need to help him somehow too.
I have a question for any of the three of you about where do you think that this mindset of self-blame comes from? Where are people picking it up? Like, it's very obvious to see where like scapegoating of people of color comes from, right? We see that all over the place. But where are people, and has it always been this way? Like this, does this go back to like, the founding of this country and the kind of individualism, or why has it reached this kind of like toxic extreme of I will blame myself for my poverty? Any thoughts on that?
I think, go ahead, Jen. I see you leaning forward. Go ahead.
It's funny. I mean, I do think there are elements to that in like our history, but at the same time, like where I was, there's also this, long history of like unions and, community bonding together to fight against the coal company. So there definitely are different narratives that people could draw on. It's funny, we were talking about addiction earlier, and the self-help narrative that you learn when you're addicted to something, or if you're in recovery, as well as like if you've gone through trauma, is this idea that like you should take things day to day. It's up to you to like save yourself. You can't depend on anyone else to do it for you. And like, trying to control the future is just going to make you like overwhelmed and sick again. So you should just focus on yourself. And I think I don't know if it has had like a measurable impact, but this story of the self is one I did hear a lot. That it's up to you to save or protect you. And someone might have hurt you and they were wrong to do that. Like the institutions are at fault, but it's your fault now if you get tricked again, is what I heard.
Wow. Yeah. It's interesting that Erica, you're talking about the self-blame and the blame part of it. I think that's right. And it leads to shame. I think we've got to think about shame, that what's happened to the losers of globalization, to the losers of coal industry and oil, to the divested from, to these rural areas, what's happened to them is they said, oh, hey, it's my fault. They've applied this individualism to that and are ashamed that they aren't. I mean, what are the sources of pride to be a good father and to provide? Job gone, to provide, literally go to the store gone. Provide to what family? You're on a third partner. You're not living with the kids, your own children. Partner gone. Connection daily with children gone. There's a lot of shame attached to this. And I think we need to think about that. And I think part of the secret appeal of Donald Trump was dealing with shame. He not only said, oh, I'll get you back on track, America great again, you great again. But he also dealt in a confrontational way under the radar with shame. My own thought is that for 4 years when he was president, we every other day were witness to a kind of de-shaming ritual that went like this. Had 3 parts. The first part, he would say something outrageous, shame-worthy. Oh, all immigrants are criminals, right? Or it's fine to beat people up, whatever. He would say something outrageous. Then the punditry would shame him. You can't say that. You shouldn't say it if you're anybody, and certainly the president, you can't. That's outrageous. You can't say that. Nation response. And then part 3, Trump rages against the shamers. Rages against the shamers. And I think unconsciously that actually relieved some people. Get the shamers out, get the shame off me. Any religion in a way, sort of, Christianity, I will take the shame upon myself. It says Jesus, there's a shame relief. And I think covertly he has exploited the psychological results of the losses that years of policy have created. And we need to think about that. But isn't that something we could think about across races, on class lines?
I find that to be a really stunning insight. Like I have chills right now, Arlie. I think that is such a crucial insight that we need to think a lot more about. Like what's our version, what's our de-shaming ritual that's healthy and productive and not racist.
Right.
I agree with that. And I would add the other corollary to that, Arlie, to me, is the whole way that the left and Democrats talk about experts and the sort of we can't as a group fathom why these people don't listen to the experts without seeing how many times the experts have been dead wrong about everything from OxyContin being non-addictive to NAFTA creating millions of jobs for blue collar workers. Not that we should be completely anti-expert, but the left just doesn't know what to do with people who are skeptical about the experts in the same sort of way. And Trump's lashing out at experts constantly was really very affirming, I think, to a lot of folks who have that skepticism.
And often those experts are perceived as shaming themselves.
Yeah. Right.
Oh, these uneducated people. Yeah.
Exactly.
Or a source of shame. And actually, the people I'm talking to feel the left is a giant shame machine.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh yeah.
Given up on, oh, you're poor, you're white, I'm giving up on you. Why should I? We have struggles of ourselves. Why should we ever talk to you? You know, and shame. So that's why. See, the one guy that was so mad that I'm so fascinated with, I keep going back to about my 12th interview with him and his wife, you know, because I feel a promise if I could just figure out how to psychologically reach this guy. He's angry at the left shaming him because it presumes who he is. He doesn't feel himself to be a racist, but does feel shamed by the left. And I asked him, well, where are your sources? Who do you know on the left? Where's this coming from, you know? And it's all, he doesn't really know anybody on the left. He's reaching for it, but getting pushed back. So he's mad. And the last thing he told me is, and I don't even want to be mad. He says, I'm a fake racist. I said, well, what is a fake racist? Well, you know, someone in response to the left. Well, how is this dynamic going? What, you know, I just feel I'm a little bit, my thoughts are kind of tangly because it feels so tangled, but I do feel there is a way through this labyrinth, but you have to go carefully, but always thinking about shame too.
Phaedra, I wondered if you're the newest person in the group, and I know you're standing in for Matt. I hope you'll join us again if and when Matt can come. But did you have any reflections or comments back to anything you've heard from the Working America perspective? Do you guys see things similarly, differently? I'd hate to put you on the spot, but I will. Where are you thinking?
Yeah, no, I thank you for the robust conversation. I think that, you know, a lot of the question about finding the unifiers and what kind of message resonates with folks. You know, our work is in urban areas, but it's also in suburban and sometimes in rural. There are challenges, of course, with like the actual canvassing in rural areas, but we're kind of overcoming that with our ability to use phone and SMS. But I think, you know, what we have found is when we're having conversation with folks and being able to talk to them, it really is about like finding that unifier. Like what keeps coming back to me is that idea of like mistrust of government. Something similar happens when we talk about the economy and like, you know, the rich getting richer or corporations not paying their fair share, right? Like that's unifying, like pretty much everyone can agree to that and can kind of sign on to that. So oftentimes we don't come to the door well, we definitely don't come as a Democrat because we're not. We'll come as, you know, fighting for working people and having a conversation with folks about what they care about. And a lot of times people will name corporate accountability as an issue that they care about. And so then we can start to have a conversation on something that is unifying like economics. So I definitely see a lot of kind of overlap. And the idea people have told us in rural areas and in urban areas, like, you know, folks don't often talk to themselves, but the same folks that we talk to in urban areas feel just as left behind as the folks in rural areas, but they don't see themselves left behind in the same way. And so they feel like there's just this like physical, like geographical divide, but also this kind of like conceptual divide. But I think someone said earlier, if you could get these folks in a room, they might find that they have a lot more in common than they do different.
I love what you say about feeling left behind in different ways. That's very distilling for us, yeah.
I think we would love, Phaedra, to have you and or Matt back to hear much more, about the kinds of things your canvassers have been hearing from people, and drawing out some of those distinctions and commonalities more would be really, really helpful. And I know from sitting in on other Working America debriefings, they are always chock full of amazing insights. I think we're going to have to bring this discussion to a close. Oh, sorry. No, go ahead. You can go ahead, Phaedra. No, okay.
No, I was just agreeing with you. Like we would love to share.
Awesome. Okay, so thanks again to all the speakers, and then I think Anthony has a few other items for us to whisk through.
Yes, super quick. Yeah, this was wonderful, and I hope we'll do this again. I'd love to hear from Bill as he gains more insights with the Wisconsin Farmers Union and their rural organizing. Maybe Bill and Matt and Phaedra could kind of present two different approaches to the same goal of uniting working people. But I'd love to, this kind of group learning is terrific. Really quickly, in the midst of a lot of other things that are going on, basically two other efforts are materializing out of our group. Chloe and Cody, Erica and Cody and I are meeting periodically. Most of the time I report on what I've neglected to do since the last time we met, but just about 3 minutes before the meeting started, I did send a draft proposal partially completed to them. This is the effort to take all that we've been doing and make it bigger and sort of take it to the national level, connecting with groups like Working America and rural organizing, and seeking financial support for that, because we need some help. We need some people that are paid to help gather information to help implement. So that's been kind of on my back burner, but it's moving closer to the front. And Heidi, a member of our group who hasn't been able to attend for a while with Just Transition Fund, is still interested in potentially funding that effort. So that would help a lot to maybe make our work more scalable. Second thing is there's been a flurry of activity around the rural-urban divide series that I started doing about a year ago. And most of it of late has been actually focused on Democrats. I did a presentation for a group in Virginia that then led to 5 different local Democratic committees asking for me to present to them on the rural-urban divide because they don't understand it. They want to know what to do about it. And the state Democratic Party of Virginia has decided on June 12th to hold a 2-hour statewide training on the rural-urban divide. So that's a pretty cool thing. That's progress for sure. And the other thing is that starting next month, June 8th through June 29th, we're doing the rural-urban divide series, but it's the biggie-sized version, because Erica and Kathy are both joining that at 2 different times. And so there'll be 4 different sessions, 1 hour each on 4 consecutive Tuesdays. And it's being promoted through a variety of groups. But I would love it if, I'll send you the link and I'll send you the little blurb about it. But if everybody who's part of this group could promote it through their own circles, I think it'll be the deepest dive we can take, because I usually do this training in somewhere between 2 sessions and 20 minutes. A lot of these Democratic committees want me to do it in 20 minutes. And here we're gonna have 4 1-hour sessions. So we'll be able to both go into presentations more deeply, but also have more discussion. So I'm really excited about that. It's June 8th through June 29th. I'll send the link to everybody, but it'd be wonderful if you could, it'd be great to have you among the participants, and also just spread the word through your folks and your networks and your colleagues. That would be great. So those are the 2 main things at this point. Erica, Cody, did you want to add anything to that? No?
I think that covers it.
Okay. And Jen, we'll just extend to you the invitation to join the group, as it were. If you think you can, we meet roughly every 4 to 5 weeks, and just continue to evolve the strategy as well as this in-house learning. So hopefully with Matt and Phaedra joining, and if you feel you can, we would welcome you. We'd even teach you the secret handshake.
Oh my gosh, thank you.
Yeah.
Wow,
great.
thank you. I'd love to. Yeah,
Excellent.
wow.
Okay. All right.
Can I just chime in really quick to say, I really do not like Zoom and anything digital, but this session was so good. I feel like it has completely rehabilitated my whole vision of Zoom. This is like, this little hour 15 was probably the best thing I've done all year. So I really appreciate the presenters, really blew the doors off. I'm gonna be thinking about this for a long time. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Cody. And actually that's one other thing. Everybody think about how we can use the recording. Recording's not the same as live, but let's think about how to disseminate it, how to, get it into people's hands, because there was just a tremendous amount of content discussion.
I just wanted to echo everything. It was such an amazing conversation, and really validating and comforting to hear all the same analysis in different parts of the country.
Terrific. Thank you, Chloe. Great.
I'll just add one thing too, and echo how great the discussion was, and then to say, like for future sessions of the work group, like even though we've sort of had a few ideas that we've been pursuing and are, to the point where we're trying to get funding for them, but kind of what the shape that this group takes is still, I think, very much an open book, and we're looking to everyone who's involved, including newcomers, to, really help us figure out what are the projects that make sense for us to take on, to like fill in the gaps where, a lot of other groups are doing work, but where can we kind of like, what's our niche? Like, I think we're going to want to try and have like more focused discussions on that in the future. So be ready to bring your ideas.
Great. Well, thank you again so much to Kathy, Jen, and Arlie, and then to everyone else. We'll do another doodle poll here soon about the next meeting date. Maybe we can strive to arrive at something that's regular and predictable instead of going through the doodle poll effort each time. But for now, we'll do that one more time. And everyone have a wonderful weekend. And I really appreciate all that you all have done today.
Okay, great to meet you all.
Thank you.
Yeah, great to have time with you all.
Yep.
Thanks for inviting us.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.